welcome to another episode of Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is writer David Maraniss, and we'll be talking about his new book, A Path Lit by Lightning. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm a sucker for librarians and libraries, so I'm happy to.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you in person because I've just been such a fan of your books, and I think you just do a great. You're just great. So, your new book, A Path Lit by Lightning, is a biography of Jim Thorpe, and many of us, if we knew who Jim Thorpe was at all, we were introduced to him in those childhood biographies, which simplified everything about his life. What was the impetus for you? Why did you choose him to do your next big biography?
Well, you're so right. So many people, when I told them I was writing this book, said, "Oh, I read about him in fourth grade." Or alternately, "Oh, I saw the 1951 movie starring Burt Lancaster." Those were the ways that people knew the story. I didn't know much more about him than that either when I started. But of course, the whole point of being a biographer is to learn about life and illuminate history and sociology through someone's life. I'm not a sports writer, but I have written sports biographies in the past, one on Vince Lombardi, the football coach, and one on Roberto Clemente, the beautiful ball player. And in those books, as with Thorpe, I saw the chance to use the drama and action of sports as a way to illuminate sociology and history. Jim Thorpe was so much more than an athlete. It gave me the opportunity to write about the Native American experience through the Stations of the Cross of his life. The idea was first broached to me a long time ago, more than 2 decades ago, when I was in Denver on book tour for my book on Vietnam in the 60s. And someone who was at the event, who was from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, a writer named Norbert Hill, came up to me afterwards with this sheaf of papers and said, "David, this is your next book, Jim Thorpe." And I politely said, "Thank you. I don't take ideas from other people. It has to come organically." And I'm writing another book right now. But he planted the seed. And it took a long time to grow, but I'm glad that it did.
Do you plan your next book well in advance? I mean, do you know, for example, what your next book is going to be?
That's a great question, Nancy, because this is the first time in 30 years since my first book on the biography of Bill Clinton that I've purposely not planned my next book. My wife and I, we're 73 years old, and we're going to take a gap year. So after writing books nonstop for 30 years, I do have some other books that I will get to, including a second volume of my biography of Barack Obama, who I left off at a fairly early age. But I won't do that until his second memoir or book about his presidency comes out, and his library is more complete. It's really at an initial stage of documents there now. So I only get one more shot at it. So I'm not going to do that one probably next. But I hope I'm around to finish that one.
When you do your research for a book, I imagine that you have like piles of 3x5 note cards. I mean, I remember I have a master's degree in history, and I remember doing the research. Of course, that was way before computers because we're almost the same age. And I remember the fear of losing one of those important footnotes, the reference to that. So how do you go about your research?
I'm very old school. Speaking of index cards, before I started my first book, which was the Clinton biography, I talked to Taylor Branch and Robert Caro, two great biographers who I deeply admire. and they shared, I just said, how do you do it? And Taylor said that he used index cards. So for my first 2 or 3 books, I used index cards. I had 5,000 or 10,000 of them, arranged by chronology and theme, in shoe boxes. And it worked. Now I still don't use one of those fancy computer organizational tools, but I use 3-ring binders instead. So for the Thorpe book, as for my last 4 or 5 or 6 books, I've had shelves full of 3-ring binders. And then I will take, by subject and theme. And then before I start writing the book, I'll take all of that material and process it one more time into sort of my master notes, which can be 300 or 400 single-spaced, single-type pages. And even then, I work chapter by chapter. I refine the notes even more and add detail to them. I'm not the sort that writes out a long outline. One of my closest writing friends, Rick Atkinson, who writes about military history, has outlines that are longer than his books. I don't do that. I'll for each chapter, I'll try to figure out where I want to start, where I'll probably end, and what the important points are through that chapter. But then I'll sort of let the magic happen from there. I don't want everything to be laid out ahead of time. So that's basically my organizational process. I've always told younger writers, nonfiction writers, that every hour you spend getting control of your material will save you hours and hours of writing time, if you have it ready.
Besides Taylor Branch and Robert Caro, are there other biographers that you maybe not have influenced you, but that you read with pleasure?
Oh yeah, many. Stacy Schiff.
That's who I was. Yeah, I love her book as well.
I apologize. I don't know how to pronounce her first name because I've only just read it. But Marianne Lee, I think it's great. I read with McCullough and some of the older standards. I admire all of those, but I would say Caro is my first role model in terms of trying to get all of the details in every possible way and then write it in a storytelling fashion.
Right.
But there are a lot of, I do read a lot of biography and many that I admire.
When you started this book about Jim Thorpe.
Millard is another one, by the way, who I really like.
I'm sorry.
Candace Millard is another one.
Oh yeah, Candace, I agree. Yes, we have those biographers in common. Absolutely, Candace Millard. When you started working on A Path Lit by Lightning, or when you imagined it, did you think that it would be? Did you plan as detailed as you go into it, or is that the reward of being a good researcher that you found all this information?
I guess the way to answer that is, I know it's always out there. I just have to go find it. And this biography was different from my earlier ones for several reasons. One was that Jim Thorpe died in 1953. He was born in 1887. So it's really the first biography I've written where there were no contemporary people to interview. Yeah. Even his children were all gone by the time I started researching it. So that's one significant difference. So I relied more on archival research and oral histories and all of that than I would in my other biographies. The second major difference was COVID. One of my mottos is go there, wherever the story is based. So, for my Lombardi biography, I've told this story many times and my wife always blanches, but I turned to her in 1996 and said, how would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter? To which she responded, "Burr," but we did. And I've done that for almost all of my books. I could not do that this time
Right.
because of COVID. I would have spent considerable time in Oklahoma, and I couldn't. It was sort of the epicenter of COVID. I just couldn't be there.
Right.
I
Right.
didn't get to Stockholm where he won his gold medals for the very same reason. So in that sense, it was different. I found ways around that, but the go there part of it was harder for this book.
I lived for 23 years in Oklahoma, sort of before I moved to Seattle, because my husband got a job teaching at Oklahoma State University. So we were there. And even there, Jim Thorpe, still, I mean, he wasn't buried there, first of all. So you didn't learn a lot about Jim Thorpe being in Oklahoma, or even as my children did growing up in Oklahoma, I think. And I wonder whether if he had not been a Native American, and therefore the other, whether we would have learned more. He would have been more at the front of our experience, especially for people who are interested in sports.
Yeah, I would expect so. I mean, I think that, in terms of Oklahomans, he's on a level with Will Rogers, who you probably learned more about.
Right.
I mean, I would say those are the two transcendent figures, not political.
Right.
And I did travel through Oklahoma on the book tour, Nancy, and, in Tulsa, in Oklahoma City. And one of the more meaningful aspects of that was the number of Native Americans who came and thanked me for writing the book. So, the experience of white Oklahomans might have been somewhat different from Native American Oklahomans in terms of where Thorpe stood in their pantheon of major figures. But even among white, Congressman Cole, who I might not agree with on any political issue, is giving the book to all of his people for Christmas, So, and in Oklahoma City, I met the mayor, who I really like, David Holt, who's a big book person, spoke at Full Circle Books, and so I didn't find Thorpe to be buried there. Maybe he wasn't as big as he could have been, but I was heartened by the reception.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Jim Thorpe, you talk about, of course, you talk about Thorpe's childhood and his experiences, and one of the formative experiences in his life was that he was sent to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And I think for a lot of readers, reading about the Carlisle Indian School and the other Indian schools that were at that time built in Canada and the United States was really a revelation. What part do you think being there played in Thorpe's life?
Well, I think that the Indian boarding school experience was at the center of anyone's life who went through them. And I found that to be true with so many people I talked to while I was doing the book, and then even more so afterwards. For Thorpe, it's sort of a mixed bag in a sense that nobody would know of him at all if not for that boarding school.
Right.
That's where he gained fame as a football player and track star, international fame after the Olympics. On the other hand, it was always a diminishing experience for anybody who went through that. Carlisle was actually the third boarding school that Jim had been to. The first one was in Oklahoma, the second Fox boarding school, where his twin brother died when a disease swept through the school. And that was a very, very common experience in all of the Indian boarding schools. The preponderance of deaths of young students at all of those schools, including Carlisle, where the most haunting experience for me when I was there was going through the student cemetery. 186 young students who went to Carlisle and never got back to their homelands because they died there, and that's just a partial number of those who got sick or died. So the motto of the Carlisle School was that unbelievable, kill the Indian, save the man.
Right.
And it was meant to be a progressive idea, that well-intentioned white people, rather than literally killing Native Americans, would try to make them white to save them. That was the whole process. It was forced assimilation. And so, Jim Thorpe went through that process, like most of the young Native Americans who did. He didn't fully buy into it. It didn't fully change him. He maintained his Native American identity, as did so many. But that was the process that they had to deal with. And it was something that sort of reflected everything that Native Americans dealt with throughout their lives.
One of the themes that runs through the book is the number of people who really took advantage of, used Jim Thorpe in many ways. And one of those was Pop Warner, the great football, the successful football coach at the Carlisle School. Could you talk a little bit about that period and how Pop Warner, who when we think about Pop Warner, I mean, there's that whole Pop Warner football.
Yes, football,
people revere him.
Yeah.
But his relationship with Thorpe was more complicated.
It was, as it was with all of his Native American athletes. He was a innovative and brilliant football coach. He developed many of the formations and that are still in use today, and he was an early proponent of the forward pass, which only became legal while he was at Carlisle. He had winning teams. The Carlisle Indian School defeated all of the great schools in the East Coast, which in that period, unbelievably, were Ivy League schools, Yale and Penn and Harvard and Princeton, plus West Point and Syracuse and a few others. And his team was incredibly popular. Wherever they played, there would be sellout crowds. But the irony there, Nancy, is that people came to see them play because they were good, but also because they were exotic. They were Indians.
Right.
But they were playing for a school that was trying to drum that part of them out of them and make them white, So, but anyway, Pop Warner, brilliant coach, not a brilliant human being. By the end of his tenure at Carlisle, his players had turned against him, said he was physically and mentally abusive. And at the crisis point of Jim Thorpe's life, when his medals were rescinded, taken away from him after the Olympics because he had played minor league baseball, Pop Warner lied about it to save his own reputation.
Yeah, another person who doesn't come off very well in the biography is Avery Brundage, the head of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee.
Well, Brundage doesn't come across well in any of my books. He's a villain in another one too, a book I wrote about the 1960 Rome Olympics, and even in a book that my son Andrew wrote about the 1936 Olympics. He was a miserable human being. The interesting thing about his relationship with Thorpe was that he too was a decathlete at those 1912 Stockholm Games. He was not very good. He was mediocre. Thorpe crushed him in the competitions, and Brundage actually dropped out before the final of the 10 events because he was being beaten so badly, which sort of goes against his whole notion of it's not what nationality you represent or how you perform, but just the beauty of amateurism, which was a sham from the beginning. But in any case, after that period, he rose to become, as you say, the head of the International Olympic Committee. And for decades, he refused to give Jim Thorpe his due. It wasn't until after Brundage was dead and gone that Thorpe finally got his medals restored and records.
Another theme that runs through the book is the way Jim Thorpe was exoticized, but was kind of romanticized and dehumanized at the same time. And you talk about the phrase, "Lo, the poor Indian." Could you expand on that?
Well, I think that one of the central threads of the book is that way of dealing with Native Americans, romanticizing and diminishing them at the same time, was common with all of them, not just Jim Thorpe. And that's the way white society dealt with Indians. They were all, people would proudly say that they had some Cherokee blood in them, white people. They would never say that about having African-American blood. There's a different sensibility based on, the history of the two, even though, African-Americans were enslaved and Native Americans were killed, the white society dealt with them differently. So "Lo, the poor Indian" is a phrase that, for reasons that I can't tell you, Nancy, became popularized by sports writers in the early parts of the 20th century. Whenever they were writing about Indians, they'd use that phrase. It became so popular that they could just write "lo, poor" or "low," and the readers would know what they were talking about. And it could be used for better or worse. If a Native American was suffering in some sense, "Lo, the poor Indian." If they were defeating the white team in football, "Lo, the poor Indian," nonetheless. For Jim Thorpe, it was very commonly applied to him after he lost his gold medals and so many of the events that he suffered through in his life.
You mentioned at the beginning of when we started talking about the biographical film that was made of him, starring Burt Lancaster. That's ironic in and of itself. And there's a scene in the book where one of Jim Thorpe's daughters is waiting for a bus, and the film is playing at the movie theater across the street, I believe it was. Did he see the film?
He saw it, and his third wife, Patsy, saw it. He was given a modest salary for being a consultant on the film, but the people who produced it didn't really consult him much at all. And he had very mixed feelings about the movie. First, Burt Lancaster is a movie star. He's actually a very good athlete as well. So in that sense, it could have been worse. Thorpe always wanted a Native American to play him. And as a matter of fact, for much of that latter period of his life, he lived in Southern California and worked on the fringes of the studio industry. He appears in more than 70 films, as an extra or a very minor character. But during that period, he was constantly campaigning for the studios to hire real Indians to play Indians, real Native Americans to play Native Americans, which they often did not do. So it's classic that in this case, it would not be a Native American playing Jim Thorpe. The director of that movie, Michael Curtiz, was an excellent director who directed Casablanca. So, it had a pretty high-powered people behind it. And, in essence, it's a sympathetic movie, but it's wrong. And it's the most wrong thing about it is something we talked about, Pop Warner, who is the narrator of the movie. And the implication is that if only Thorpe had listened to Pop and more successfully assimilated into white society, he wouldn't have suffered the way he did, which is, it's just wrong. So that's the way I view the movie. And there's a whole chapter in the book sort of deconstructing all of that.
Right. What was the thing that most, I guess this has got to be our last question, but sadly, but what was the thing that surprised you the most in doing the book? Because when I was reading it, the thing that surprised me the most was that was it Marianne Moore, the poet, who taught at the Carlisle Indian School. I thought, that is, wow, who would have thought?
Oh, I agree
But-
completely. Yeah, I mean, it's not a huge thing, but who would have thought this great American poet? You know, she was 23, just out of Bryn Mawr, and her family lived in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and she taught there. And I went up to the Rosenbach Library in Philadelphia and found a sort of a partial memoir that she wrote where she talks about all of that and some other materials up there that allowed me to introduce her into the book. And yeah, I just love, you know, she's probably the jewel of those so many famous people who somehow intersected with Jim Thorpe throughout his life, you know, from the generals, Dwight Eisenhower, who played football against him, and George Patton, who was on the Olympic team with him, all the way through. You find all of these characters. And Marianne Moore was the most surprising and delightful.
So I guess we could say that Jim Thorpe was the Kevin Bacon of his day.
Zelig, yes, exactly.
Yeah, Zelig, right.
One of the things that I just so admire about your books is the way you take a subject, and you alluded to this at the beginning, how you take a subject and give us the readers the whole picture of the society, because it would be so easy. I mean, it's never easy, but without all of that context, there's no way of understanding who Jim Thorpe was, or any of the people whose biographies, you know.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you say that. I mean, that's my philosophy of what I do. You know, there are always going to be a few reviewers who say, you know, that there's too much of that, but I don't care if they say that, because that's what I do. I mean, that's the way I want to do it. And so, I mean, because I believe deeply that to understand someone in their fullness, you have to see the forces that shape them. And that includes, you know, geography and family and the context of their time.
Right. David Maraniss, thank you so much for being on Book Lust today. And I'm so glad I finally got to meet you in person, more or less.
And I hope I get out to Seattle someday and we can meet, what do they say, in IRL? Or
Yes, right, IRL. Okay, I will look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Okay, Nancy, bye-bye.
Bye.